Okay, here we are, part three of the Cold War lecture. I will promise I'll keep moving a little bit faster here to get through some more of this material. But like I was explaining about the goals of the Marshall Plan, we wanted to rebuild them so that they didn't have to rebuild themselves. That was what had led to a lot of the problems at the end of World War One. And you can see illustrated up here on the top left that Stuttgart, which is a city in southwestern Germany, which is sort of the part of the manufacturing base of Germany, in just 8 years, they went from being devastated, just devastated, to being almost completely rebuilt. And that just gives you a sense of how much money we sunk into that particular thing, the Marshall Plan. So Berlin Airlift. This is a pretty important concept because it really is case in point the idea of us fighting communism, the idea of the two superpowers, because remember, we had divided Germany into those two places, West Germany and East Germany. West Germany being all of the Western Allies, the parts that they had occupied at the end of World War II, and East Germany being the Soviet occupation zone after World War II. Um, the city of Berlin was the capital of Germany, and so instead of saying that just because it was in Eastern Germany it was going to belong to East Germany, no, they had divided that as well up into four different sections, and so the French, American, and British sections became West Berlin, and the Soviet section became East Berlin. So the city itself was divided, even though you can see it's right in the middle of what was East Germany. And one of the ways that the Soviets tried to pressure the Western Allies was they decided that they're going to blockade Western Germany, because the only way to get to Western Germany or to Western Berlin from West Germany was by one or two rail lines and special highways that didn't have any stops or exits in East Germany until you got to Berlin. And the Soviets wanted to pressure the Allies, and so they cut all of those off. There was no way to literally bring food and clothing and supplies into the city. And the idea was they wanted to force the Western Allies to allow the Soviets to help, which was essentially would have been them taking over the Berlin and making Berlin an entirely Eastern city. But Truman, being the internationalist that he was, he wanted to avoid war, and so he did not send the army in to force a path to West Berlin. Instead, they organized what's known as the Berlin Airlift, in which hundreds upon hundreds of planes every single day began flying from Western Germany to Berlin and dropping, like it says there, 13,000 tons of supplies every single day. You can see there on the bottom right how planes would just be lined up to take supplies, food in particular, but also clothing and other necessities into the city. It was a smashing success for the West. It really showed that they had the power to maintain a city without necessarily having to do whatever the Soviets wanted them to do. And so it was a major embarrassment for the Soviets, and eventually they dropped their blockade and allowed their rail lines and the highways to reopen, because otherwise it would have been pointless. They were able to resupply by air. And it was things like this that led to the creation of NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, basically because what had happened is with the formation of the United Nations, all of the victors from World War II, which of course includes the Soviet Union, got a seat on the Security Council, which meant that they had a veto power and they could block anything that the Western countries were trying to do. And so they decided, well, if we can't do what we want, we'll form our own club, and they formed NATO as sort of a counterweight to the Soviet Union. You can see on this map all of the yellow countries are the NATO countries. They called themselves the peace-loving states, and again, the idea was they wanted to be secure against the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union wasn't going to let that go unanswered, and so they formed their own version of that called the Warsaw Pact, in which basically they took all of the countries that they basically controlled anyway and said, oh, by the way, you're joining our own version of NATO, and we're going to call that the Warsaw Pact. And so as you can see, the Soviets, using this sort of collective power that they all had together, they created an atomic bomb, which started a nuclear arms race. And that's where you start to see a lot of the things that we are going to talk about now in part 4. It won't be very long, I promise. We are just about done. So stick around for part 4 of this lecture.